We are well into the off season, but there are still so many unanswered questions surrounding our Calgary Flames.
You're Locked On Flames, your daily podcast on the Calgary Flames, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's episode of Locked On Flames. As always, I am your host, Jess Belmosto, and thank you so much for joining me today. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off of your first purchase. Terms apply. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. We have probably like a month, a little less than a month before the Flames start their preseason games. And I feel like there are still a lot of questions surrounding the team heading into this season. And again, the longer term picture of this team. And I thought that today would be a great day to continue to dive into those, some more of those questions and start to think and go into this season with some bullet points. So something to keep in mind while you're watching, because it unfortunately through a transition period, you're not going to just be thinking about hockey. Got to think about the rest of the behind the scenes work as well as the product you're watching on the ice. But make sure you're subscribed to Locked On Flames wherever you get your podcasts, as well as YouTube. We are here for you through the off season, and we'll be back to daily podcasts before you know it. You can find us wherever you get your favorite shows and on YouTube as well. So there have been a lot of conversations regarding aging players on soon to be expiring contracts, or players that came to Calgary with a different expectation of what they were getting themselves into. And one of those players is Blake Coleman, and this has been heavily discussed. You know, Blake Coleman signed in Calgary after winning back-to-back Stanley Cups and expected to come into a team that was ready to compete and like on the brink of true contention. And they've done a 180 in a matter of 3 seasons. So this is a player that is still impactful, right? He is still playing at a very high level. And I enjoy what Blake Coleman brings to this team. I think that he brings that competitive edge, that underdog grit that is so one of those intangibles that hockey coaches love, that everyone just eats up. And he talked about it in an interview about how he thought this was going to be a very different situation. He thought he was coming into a team long term with Matthew Tkachuk and Johnny Gaudreau, and not a rebuilding situation. And that's tough. You know, he was with New Jersey when they were when they were taking their medicine, right? This is a situation that I look at and like I can sympathize with, right? Because I'm not looking at this and saying Blake Coleman is so, greedy, or he doesn't care about the organization, because I think it's the exact opposite of that. I think that he has shown a lot of love for not just the organization, but the city of Calgary as a whole. And if you want to play where you're going to win, then the door is right there. And I don't mean that disrespectfully. I think Blake Coleman is a great hockey player and a great person, but like we've been talking about for a year now, the Flames don't want hostages. If you want out, you just have to speak up. And what if he is traded? Like, what does that mean for the Flames? Obviously you're losing another pillar veteran that you've had on this team for a few years now. You're losing a great penalty killer. You're losing someone, that 2/3 of that Mangiapane, Backlund, and Coleman line will be gone. And so another, two-way player that's out the door with your defense already weakened. I think him being traded is something you should expect, along with the Rasmus Andersson trade. But I do see this being like a trade deadline deal where, the team isn't just looking for like a rental. This might be a team like, I don't know, maybe let's just say the Rangers. I don't think the Rangers have any money, but let's hypothetically, a team like them who might not necessarily just be competing this year. They might be looking to go next year and the year after. And Blake Coleman still has some time left on his contract. So, like, it's not just a rental, and you aren't going to have to worry about signing him long term because that's already done. He's still productive. You still see flashes of the player he was in Tampa. And sometimes, I mean, there's a reason why Tampa won, right? And it was such a deep team, and Blake Coleman still like performs like that. He does great things with that third line. Like, I am so sad that we did not get more of Coleman's line against McDavid in the playoffs a few years ago. That shouldn't have been a last-ditch effort. Obviously coaches know best apparently, but like, to me, it's just kind of like a no-brainer to have them out there against, your best defensive line against, the best player in the world. So to me, trading Blake Coleman makes sense. Cash in while you can, because I know that teams are, looking for a guy like him. There's an opportunity to, again, add more draft capital. It's not going to be as big of a haul or a payout as like a Rasmus Andersson, but it's still something, right? And it opens up another roster spot for one of the young players. And that's something we also need to focus on here as well. And we're going to talk about here in just a bit, but you need to open up some avenues, and there are only so many spots available, immediate spots available. And if you continue to kind of weed out those players and substitute or integrate those young guys, you're going to see more development. And that's essentially what you want. But coming up next, we're going to talk about the big question mark surrounding some of the prospects and what happens if it is a quiet year for some of them, if not most of them. And we will be back right after this. If you are like me, you love going to events, whether it is a sporting event, a concert, a comedy show, theater, you name it, Game Time has you covered. I love using Game Time to get my MLB tickets to go to my Red Sox games, or just like last season when I went down to Long Island to see the Flames. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. And, with Game Time, you can see the view from your seat. You have the all-in pricing toggle option, and it shows you the total upfront with no surprise fees at checkouts, which is fantastic. And the lowest price guaranteed, or Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. Your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off of your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off of your first purchase. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Thanks everyone for hanging out with me today on Locked On Flames. Make sure you're subscribed wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube. I'd love to hear from you in the comments, or if you're feeling kind and want to leave a nice little rating and review, that goes a very long way. The Flames prospects, right? Like the Flames have consistently picked in the middle of the draft for a very long time. And the players that they have acquired through these drafts are not necessarily your players that are going to come right out of juniors and make the NHL roster and stay at the NHL roster. They're players that need to fully develop, I guess, and before they get a true shot at the NHL. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it just, it's where you pick in the draft, and it says a lot about your scouting, because sometimes there are those steals. There is a helicopter flying over us right now, so I apologize if you can hear that. It sounds like I'm about to be abducted by aliens. But no, there are players that go later in the draft that become superstars. I think of David Pastrnak and Wyatt Johnston. There are players that are sneaks, and that happens. You can't predict that. However, if statistics tell you anything, is that the higher you pick in the draft, the better the player. And that's just how it literally just works like that. That is how drafts work. And that's why everyone wants to be number one. And the Flames just don't have that. They had it this year, picking 9th, which was pretty special, pretty important. And we hope that this year the team takes another step and maybe drafts a little bit higher. A top 5 would be great. Another top 10 is a success as well. But I would say that the pressure is on these current prospects, because you are hoping to see some growth and development, especially from players like Matt Coronato and Dustin Wolf, and the few remaining unsigned RFAs. You hope that they have taken a step in their game that will allow them to solidify themselves as part of the NHL roster. And if not, then definitely a frequent in-betweener sort of situation, right? Not everyone is going to have this breakout season right out of the gate like a Martin Pospisil or a Connor Zary. That's just not something that happens often, which is why last season watching that happen was so special and fascinating, because those guys were not projected to be full-time NHLers last year. Martin Pospisil had just missed the entire season due to injury and was considering retiring because of how severe his post-concussion syndrome had become. Connor Zary, again, missed a lot of last season due to injury and eventually worked his way up, but it made more sense to project him at the AHL level. But they proved pretty much everyone wrong, and we hope they can run it back this year too. You're hoping to see that progress, that forward motion, and that is a step in their development, and you cannot predict what is going to happen. That's why some players take off before. It's why some players are late bloomers, or some players just never take off at all, and they're career AHLers, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. You're still a professional athlete. There's nothing to be ashamed of there, but you obviously hope every single draft pick becomes something special to your team. And that's just it's not possible. But I do think people are putting a lot of stock in these prospects. And that's not a bad thing. I mean, that's really essentially what you're watching this hockey season for. You're not necessarily expecting to get a 100-point season out of Jonathan Huberdeau, so you're not going to watch for that. You're going to watch for Dustin Wolf and to see how he's doing and how far he comes from game 1 to game 82. Like, it's not necessarily a good season, but there's things to watch for. And like I talked about with JD from Locked On Sharks the other day, you're emotionally invested in these young players. You want them to fully develop and grow and blossom into what you have, like Kadri in his prime, Huberdeau in his prime, Matthew Tkachuk, Johnny Gaudreau, a healthy Sean Monahan. You want to have that. You want to have a generational goaltender in Dustin Wolf. You want all of that, but it's a matter of them getting there and taking those steps to get there. And just because you don't see that in year 1 or year 2 doesn't mean it's never going to happen. Players, you cannot predict this. You're hoping by year 2 of their ELC, they have taken those steps, because otherwise it's like, what else can we do for you? And I'm not gonna sit here and say, oh, the Flames need to throw these kids to the wolves and have them be all at the NHL level, but you want to see them develop with tougher competition like the NHL players. There are players, like 19-year-old players, that will eventually basically be going up against guys who are old enough to be their dad, like double their age, things like that. It's not anything. I mean, it is scary. It is a very big step, but it's a step that has to happen. I was looking at some projections for the Pacific Division standings, and 2 of, I think, the 3 or 4 that I saw had the Flames at the bottom. That is unfortunately where you want to be and where you're going to be with such a young team. Go back and listen to my episode from earlier this week with JD from Locked On Sharks, where we talk about all of this and what you can expect through this process. And coming up next, we're going to talk about the one and only Connor Zary, and is he capable of finding success at the center spot? Thank you, everyone, for hanging out with me today on Locked On Flames. Make sure you leave a 5-star rating and a nice little review on Apple Podcasts. I appreciate it, and I know it helps the show as well, and we can enjoy this season together. There is a lot of pressure on younger guys, I would say, because the spotlight's on them. You are not guaranteed a roster spot, especially these young guys. You think of your Matt Coronado, where he's kind of on the cusp, or a Walker Dewar, who is more than likely going to start in the NHL potentially, depending on how these contracts shake out. It's just a matter of finding things and hoping that they stick. And sometimes that is resorting or reverting back to the position you drafted the player at. Because how many times have we seen players get drafted as centers and then play on a wing, or vice versa, right? Maybe it's a situation like Rasmus Anderson and Mackenzie Weegar. You want both of these guys on your top pairing, but one of them is going to have to play their offside. It is crucial for the Flames to have Connor Zary at center. And the organizational lack of center depth is a cause for concern and has been for years. Elias Lindholm I think he's a great player, but he is going to be a 2C on a very, very good team, depending on, who those top line wingers are, right? Like, he's more than likely going to be 1C in Boston, but that's because, David Pastrnak and Brad Marchand are right there. And, but it could be Pavel Zacha. With the Flames, you don't necessarily have like a set 1C. I've seen people project it to be Sharon Govich. I've seen people project it to be Backlund. I've seen people project it to be Kuzmenko and Connor Zary. I have seen, like, there's no definitive answer, which is a problem within itself. He has not played center since his like junior days, since prior to being drafted. That was until Craig Conroy and Ryan Huska put their big brains together and said, post-trade deadline, let's put him at center. And it was great. You started seeing a lot better hockey from him and his line mates. Now, obviously, playing with Kadri and Pospisil for 90% of the season was great for him. It did wonders for him, especially boosting his confidence and getting him to an NHL like consistency issue, not issue, but like to where, that structure, that consistency, and just having that you weren't messing around with him too much. You weren't moving him up and down the lineup without cause. You had him with a veteran. And ultimately that was their best line this past season. So I do think that if you find that he has a lot of success at center, you keep him at center, because then that shifts your needs and your priorities. This next draft is going to be very good, especially with the Flames being projected to be a top 10 pick. You need whatever you can get. And if you are able to look at your depth chart and say, okay, like we have Connor Zary as center, and you kind of plug what else needs to be around there, and you look like not just at your NHL roster, but your AHL and your other prospects, like you do need to focus on that center depth. But is there a more glaring need that you take at that 7th overall spot? And we talked about it with JD from Locked On Sharks. You take the best player available. It doesn't really matter what position it is, unless it's quite literally you're taking the best player available, and that's going to shift your needs as well. But you've built a draft plan around that. You haven't done it on hypotheticals necessarily. But for the Flames, I am hoping this season is the season where we find Zary back in the center role, and he is able to essentially, I'm trying to think of what like the right word would be. He's able to find his groove there as easily as he did towards the end of last season, but also how smooth his transition from the AHL to the NHL was. And if it takes time, that's not an issue. I want to see him get a fair chance at center. And we've seen and heard the coach talk about, this player will get a shot at center. Pospisil is going to get a shot at center. So they're not ruling anything out without experimenting with it. And I really hope that there is continued success for Zary at center. And when you look at it, who do you put on his wing, right? I mean, I personally think, you put Pospisil there, at least to start the season. I think that would be great. And I think you put, maybe a guy like Sharon Govich just to again, just feed him the puck. Just feed him the puck. That's all you need to do. And I want to make sure all options are exhausted before they try going a different route. And I think that with this clear path that they have committed to in terms of this next generation of Calgary Flames hockey, they will. And they're not just going to look at a situation and be like, we need to fix this immediately. Like it doesn't need to be repaired immediately. Like, it's not like, Johnny Gaudreau getting hurt and you're in a playoff spot. That's not the situation you're in. You're working towards laying these building blocks and getting these building blocks secure and ready for success at the NHL level within your organization. And I truly wish nothing but the best for everyone this season. I think it's going to be a good, fun year for the young kids. By that, I mean, I think you're going to see a lot of not so familiar faces, especially with some prospects that like William Stromgren, who's projected to potentially make the team at some point as well. So, there's going to be a lot that happens this year. And I think it's important to remember that these are all human beings on the ice. They are all human beings, regardless if this is their 10th year in the league or their second. But that will do it for me here on today's episode of Locked On Flames. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I hope you have a fantastic evening. And remember to stay safe, stay warm, stay dry, stay cool, stay hydrated, and remember to be kind. Make sure you're subscribed wherever you get your podcasts, as well as YouTube, and leave a nice little 5-star rating and review on the podcast.